Today we're going to start with just the beginning of chapter 3. But before we begin with the story, let's look at our character chart and some characters that were added in chapter 2. So we saw Jim Hawkins, the narrator, again in chapter 2. And in chapter 2, we find out that he's now going to be the cabin boy on the Espanola. The next character that we're introduced to in chapter 2 was Pew. And remember, Pew was the blind man. He was the one that gave Billy Bones the black spot, which was the letter about mutiny. He also leads the men to ransack the inn to search for the treasure. He is also part of Captain Flint's crew with Silver, aka Long John Silver. The next character we were introduced to in chapter 2 is Dr. Livesey. And remember, Dr. Livesey, of course, is the doctor, and he's who cared for Billy Bones when he had the stroke. Of course, Billy Bones didn't make it. He is one of the people that is helping to plan this trip to find the treasure, and we now know that he'll be the ship's doctor. The next person we're introduced to in chapter 2 is Squire Trelawney. And remember, he's a friend of Dr. Livesey's. He also helps to plan the trip to find the treasure, and he's the one that headed to Bristol to find a ship and a crew. And of course, he appointed himself as admiral to the Espanola. And the final person we were introduced to in chapter 2 was Long John Silver. And remember, he was hired on as a cook for the Espanola, and he also has helped to recruit a crew for the voyage. One factor is he's missing a leg, which helps him to be recognizable. Also, before we begin with the story, let's look back at some characters and how we know what the characters are like. Sometimes the story comes right out and tells us what the characters are like, but other times we have to infer what the characters are like. And remember, to infer means to make a guess from the text. So here on page 2, I jumped all the way back to chapter 1, page 2, it says, "Therefore, I take up my pen and go back to a time when my family ran the Admiral Benbow Inn, and the old seaman with the saber cut," remember, sword cut, "on his cheek came to stay with us." So what could we infer or make a guess about the old seaman if he has a sword cut on his cheek? Well, I would guess that it would make him recognizable and that he's probably lived a pretty dangerous life. So let's look at this chart. The next line says, "I remember the old seaman plodding to the inn door, dragging an enormous sea chest behind him." And that came from page 2. So what can you infer about the old seaman? Well, I'm going to guess that he might be rich. And if he's dragging an enormous sea chest, he's obviously got it from somewhere. And that's a little mysterious. I mean, where did he get this enormous sea chest from? And what's inside it? Things I want to know. So obviously this makes Billy pretty mysterious, and we know he's an old sailor. So we could say Billy is a mysterious old sailor. So this next part, they're giving us the inference, their guess, which they said Billy seems frightening and rough. And they told us to look on page 2 from some evidence from the text that would prove that Billy is frightening and rough. So here's page 2 again. We already know that the old seaman had a saber cut on his cheek. That would make him frightening and rough. But what else on this page would indicate that he's rough? So I'm going to read on. "I remember the old seaman plodding to the door in, dragging an enormous sea chest behind him. He was a tall, nut-brown man with gnarled hands and black broken nails." Well, that right there, gnarled hands and black broken nails, obviously he's rough and a little frightening. So we'll add that to our chart. Tall, nut-brown man with gnarled hands and black broken nails. So the next one, that's a quotation from the text, says, "Tell me when I've worked through that," he said, looking fierce. So just by the author telling us that he looked fierce can tell us that the author or the narrator was a little scared of him. So another way to say that is that Billy frightened and intimidated Jim and his father. So the next one is showing the inference first, and it says, "This suggests Billy is in danger and is hiding out." So we have to look at page 3 to see if we can find something that would go along with that. So remember, Billy is the sea captain. So something that would infer or imply that he is hiding out. I'm going to just read this passage. During the day, in sunshine or in driving rain, the old captain hung around the cove, keeping watch with a brass spyglass. In the evenings, he sat beside a roaring fire. We soon learned to let him be, lost as he was in his own private thoughts. Now, none of that tells me that he would be watching out for his own safety. Every day, he would ask if any seafaring men had gone by on the road. Now, that might have to do with him worrying and wanting to hide out. At first, we thought he wanted company of his own kind, but eventually we realized he wanted to avoid them. It wasn't long before I understood the reason for this odd behavior. He took me aside one day and promised me a penny on the first of every month if I would keep my eyes peeled for the seafaring man with one leg. Let me know the moment he appears, he growled. So all of those things would allude to the fact that he's hiding out and possibly in danger. And the final quotation from the text says, "The old seaman's stories about bloodthirsty pirates, ferocious storms at sea, and wild deeds on the Spanish Main terrified our guest." So we can tell by that automatically the captain's stories were scaring his listeners and that he's led a dangerous life. So here we finally are at the part you've all been waiting for. Chapter 3, The Real Adventure Begins. I said farewell to my beloved mother and the dear Admiral Benbow, and then joined up with Redruth, the squire's gatekeeper. We purchased our seats for the coach to Bristol. It picked us up around dusk, and we arrived in Bristol as the sun was rising like a shimmering peach above the city. So before we move any further, I noticed this bold word coach. Now, of course, I could look in the glossary to find the meaning, but another strategy to figure out something is called context clues. So if I read, we purchased our seats for the coach to Bristol, it picked us up around dusk, I could think, well, it's a way to travel. And back then, they were probably traveling by a horse-drawn carriage. So I'm just going to infer or guess that that's what it is. The next part that I want to look at is that very last sentence where it said, it picked us up around dusk and we arrived in Bristol as the sun was shining like a shimmering peach above the city. So that's a lot of imagery, trying to paint a picture in your head. Of course, you can think that a peach is bright and orange, and if it's shimmering above the city, you can really picture that in your head. When one thing is compared to another thing using the words like or as, we call that a simile. So here, the two things being compared was the sun was like a shimmering peach. Okay, so let's continue on with our story. Squire Trelawney was residing at an inn near the water. Along the quay lay ships of all sizes and nations. In one, sailors were singing as they worked in the morning fog that shrouded the quay. In another, men high up in the rigging were hanging by threads that seemed no sturdier than those of a spider's web. An overwhelming smell of tar and salt filled the air. I spotted old sailors with pigtails and rings in their ears. It was all new to me, and I was captivated. So we have some more bold words here, so let's stop and talk about them. The first one is quay. It says, along the quay lay ships of all sizes and nations. What I know about ships is that when they're not out sailing, they're at the dock. So if they're all along the quay, they're probably all along the dock. So again, instead of using the glossary, I was able to just read around it using my context clues and infer what it meant. The next bold word I see is shrouded. The sentence says, in one, sailors were singing as they worked in the morning fog that shrouded the quay. So if I still don't know what shrouded means by reading that, I, of course, would need to go look in the glossary. So, of course, the glossary is at the end of the book, so I need to scroll down to the end. Oh, I'm seeing some letters. So there's S, and there's shroud. Now, shroud is the root word of shrouded. Root just means the main word. So shroud means to cover or conceal. So So if I look back at the story, I can read it as, they worked in the morning fog that covered the quay or covered the dock. And that makes sense to me. The other part that I wanted to look at in this paragraph was another comparison where it says, men hanging up in the riggings were hanging by threads that seemed no sturdier than those of a spider's web. So again, two things were being compared, the rigging and threads of a spider's web. But notice there's no words like or as in this, which makes it a metaphor, which is comparing two things by saying one thing is another. There is one more bold word, but I'm going to leave that one for you to figure out. Now that we've talked about all those things, I'm actually going to go back and reread the entire page. Squire Trelawney was residing at an inn near the water. Along the quay, or dock, lay ships of all sizes and nations. In one, sailors were singing as they worked in the morning fog that shrouded or covered the quay. In another, men high up in the riggings were hanging by threads that seemed no sturdier than those of a spider's web. An overwhelming smell of tar and salt filled the air. I spotted old sailors with pigtails and rings in their ears. It was all new to me, and I was captivated. We went to see the squire. He was dressed like a naval officer in a new suit. "There you are," he cried. "The doctor arrived last night. Now our ship's company is complete. We'll set sail early in the morning at first light." The squire handed me a note to carry to Long John Silver. I made my way along the crowded quay, full of people and loaded carts, until I found the tavern. It was brighter and cleaner than I expected. The windows glistened and the floor was cleanly sanded. The customers were seafaring men, talking loudly and enthusiastically among one another. As I was waiting, a man emerged from a side room. I deduced that he must be Long John Silver. His left leg was missing and he walked with the aid of a crutch. He managed the crutch with wonderful skill, hopping about on it like a sprightly bird. Silver was tall and strong, with a face as big as a ham, yet brimming with intelligence. He whistled as he moved along the tables and had a merry word or slap on the shoulder for each one of his guests. So if I wanted to talk about a few things that I wasn't sure about, the first one would be the word emerged. Emerged isn't a bold word, but I can still figure out from the text what it means. As I was waiting, a man emerged from a side room. That would mean that he came out of the side room. Deduced is another one of those words that I'm going to let you figure out. Yes, it is a bold word, so either use your context clues or use the glossary if you can't figure it out through the context clues. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the sentence, he managed the crutch with wonderful skill, hopping about on it like a sprightly bird. So again, it's using the words like, telling us that it's a simile. So the crutch was like a sprightly bird. From the first mention of Long John Silver in the squire's letter, I had feared that he might be the very one-legged sailor I had watched out for at the Admiral Benbow. But one look at this man was enough to convince me that I had nothing to fear. I had seen the captain, I had seen Black Dog, and I had seen Pew. I thought I knew what a buccaneer looked like, and they were quite different from this clean and likable landlord. So see, he thought he knew what a sailor or a pirate looked like, and Long John Silver isn't fitting that description. That's where we're going to stop today. We will continue on with chapter 3 tomorrow.